This is the Chakula Podcast, bringing to you all the relevant topical issues and discussions about food in Kenya and beyond. We break down complex topics and dig deeper into ordinary day-to-day happenings touching on food and farming systems, bringing you a holistic, dynamic view on the food we eat. Welcome. I'm your host, Felistas Mwalia. Welcome back to the second part of the conversation on decolonization. Dr. Njoki, Professor Kimani, Njogu, and Kobuthi will be sharing with us on whether decolonization of our food and farming systems is the role of the state, the individual, or the society, or whether it's a collective responsibility, and what the government has done so far. Is it enough? What needs to be done? Karibuni. We've really been seeing our seeds being lost, how we relate with food also being lost. But from where you sit at an individual capacity or at an individual level, how can we ensure that this is not lost? What are you also doing to ensure that this is not lost?
I think that at the level of our constitution, because there is provision, and I think in Article 69 of the Constitution, which deals with, among other things, environment and so on, there is a stipulation on the protection of seeds. And I think that was very incisive on the drafters, that we do need to secure our seeds. We do need to ensure that farmers are not at the mercy of multinationals that bring in seeds which are not reproducible. Because our farmers, they are amazing. I mean, they grow crops and they know that these ones are for planting. So they kind of, these ones are for eating, these ones are for planting, and they store their foods nicely, and they wait for the rains, and they actually plant the seeds, and so on. And this has been very important. But then come in the multinationals with their seeds and their chemicals and pesticides and so on, and completely destroying that which we could. Our farmers are no longer able in certain parts to replant the seeds because they were given the impression that the seeds that they bought were better, and they planted those, and they tried to store like they assume that this is a continuity of storage of seeds, of planting, and then they realize nothing is actually germinating. So there is work to be done by those of us who engage with policy. I think there's a lot of work to be done by government and also civil society. I think we need to do more to protect the farmers. We need to do more to diversify the foods. We are aware of the challenges of the ground because of overuse and so on. And that we do need to use, kind of to move away. I mean, you see, the argument for GMOs, for example, is that with GMOs, you become more food secure. But it's a lie, really. It's a lie. The net effect of GMOs on our people is so devastating that we are better off affirming, affirming the sanctity and the dignity of our seeds, of our crops, and so on, and exploring ways in which we can amplify, those seeds and systems. We have scientists who are able to do a lot of work in that area. And they just need facilitation and more capacity to do research. in terms of multiplying the opportunities of seeds. So I think that there is misinformation, lots and lots of misinformation, which comes with the tyranny of neoliberalism and the tyranny of overthinking that only one part of the globe has monopoly of ideas, and really forgetting that, as my colleagues have said, thinking and the extension of the mind has always happened in human societies, you know, across the globe, and that it's extremely arrogant to assume that just because people have capital, that they have the monopoly of what is possible. Um, and I think that we need to deconstruct that narrative very systematically, and to say that we are thinking people, we are able to come up with solutions that are not driven by multinationals, and that we can protect um, the the dignity of our people, to and actually ensure that whatever they have is reproducible. It serves them well. It protects them. It dignifies them. It connects them with the past and the future. And that to the extent that our students are going back to they're going to school and they're doing experiments and they're doing all sorts of innovations, that it is possible for us to have the best that is rooted in our particular locations, without, of course, undermining the best from other parts of the world. I mean, we recognize, as we said, that knowledge is not located in one particular place. So we do not also claim to have monopoly of ideas. We continually learn from others, and we can pick the best from other jurisdictions, um, to serve ourselves and to serve our people. So I think that there is quite a bit of work to be done. But fundamentally, is to look for ways in which our communities, our people are food secure, that they are not at the mercy of the tyranny of the multinationals, and that they feel protected from the aggressive, what could talk about aggressive advertising, which misinforms them because they trust. I mean, we have to rebuild trust. They trust that information that comes to them is genuine, but it could actually be misinformation um, on what's good for them. So I think there's quite a bit of work to be done, and I think that there are a number of people doing this. We just need more to take an interest in these matters.
Yeah, thank you so much. Despite all that being done, like with the multinationals trying to improve food security in the country, still the numbers of hungry people is still increasing. Yeah,
Absolutely,
yeah,
absolutely.
yeah,
I mean, we have. I mean, if you look at the continent, Africa, with approximately 1 billion people, about 250 million of our people are still food insecure. So 250 million people, and part of the reason, really, forgetting, of course, the vagaries of climate change and so
yeah,
on and so on and so forth. Part of it is just the choices that have been made on on cropping and food and what is important for our people. So you have a lot of acres of land that are growing, you know, crops that are meant for other jurisdictions precisely because they bring in the money. But where does the money actually go? So I mean, I think that the future really is investing in smallholder farmers, giving them all the support they require to grow and feed the families and the neighborhood, because our smallholder farmers feed their families, they feed the neighborhood, they feed the nation. So giving them the dignity, the support, minimizing this attraction to large-scale land-based investments, which are just have a small group of people who do not reinvest and recommit themselves to communities, but rather for self-aggrandizement and for self-benefit and so on. And yeah, and really also to push back at at the narrative of the narrative around consumerism, and to say that we can decide. I mean, we know we consume, and we like leisure, we enjoy moments and so forth and so on. But we should get to decide what you know, and these rather aggressive manipulation of thinking uh, really does need to be fought back. Yeah,
Yeah.
it does.
Yeah, I really like what you said, and I feel like I need to contribute a bit to some of what you said in terms of like supporting small scale farmers. One thing that really frustrates me is the aspect of us always assuming the farmers they always need someone from outside to educate them on what they should do, but the farmers themselves are the experts. They do this on a daily basis, so they basically know what works for them and what doesn't work for them. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. To move on with the conversation, Joe, do you feel like the government is doing enough to ensure that our indigenous food is not lost? Our indigenous food is not lost, and also, basically, is the government doing anything? And is it our responsibility as individuals, or is it a collective responsibility?
Mm. So a couple of things.
Hmm.
If you look at the food global design as it is right now, as Professor said, that we actually don't underproduce food globally. A lot of food actually goes to waste. So looking at our global food designs, a lot of food that is produced is actually goes to waste because spaces where how this it has been designed, a lot of it is centered around Western nations. So that means is that even as 250 million Africans are food insecure, there's actually food going to waste. So I think, and that's really tied to what I mentioned earlier, this matrix of power. So thinking about how, even moving towards your question, that I think one, we need to recognize that these global designs are held together by three things. One, the international multinationals, the international systems, you know, big organizations out there. Secondly, the states. Kenya as a state, Uganda as a state, America as a state. It holds these global designs. Thirdly, the class of people that hold the state together. So once you understand that, I think it can be a bit disingenuous even for one to press the state to do something that is not designed for. It's a bit disingenuous to say that. That said, I think we need two projects concurrently working. One is a reform project, whereby how do we engage with policy at the level of international organizations, FAO, the UN, etc., to redesign some of these things in terms of supply chains. How do you make food more local, etc., as a reform project, and that as well also within the government, pushing them in terms of how do they, to what extent do we know, knowing how it was designed, that it can keep the indigenous seeds, indigenous products, indigenous culture, etc., to the extent that we have an awareness of how this thing was designed, can 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 maintain those things. And thirdly, with places like this, also a bit of education information towards this particular class of individuals who hold these global designs intact, such that to demystify, to narrativize things that are toxic and harmful to the majority of people who are going food hungry, but also nations at large. But concurrently to that, knowing its limitations, there's some conversations that can be had with them that can only be had within the levels of the political society, where you and I, not within the level of the state, a level of the political society, knowing how do you start having conversations with local farmers, because local farmers to cultivate, to restore their own indigenous products, seeds, etc. Knowing, because that kind of change can only happen at that level, at the local level. Knowing, if we can do supply chains at the level of policy, but there has to be a different conversation and a different way of organizing away from the instruments of the matrix of power, such that we understanding that this, Bible says a good tree does not produce bad fruit, etc. So knowing that very well, how do you start having different conversations at the level of the global political society, away from the institutions that hold this matrix of power together? So that conversation may happen at a podcast like this, happening in Njoki spaces, Professor Kimani spaces, with local farmers, with local organizations, away from this matrix of power. And so you build a kind of, not really a critical mass to engage, but what you're doing is that you're building for building sake for yourselves. So you're, as Njoki said, you're recentering the conversation. So,
And does the government have a role to play in this?
I think, as I said, the role of the government in this space is people knowing that space is a conversation on reform.
Mm-hmm.
So being very aware of its limitations because of how it was designed. So you're very aware of its limitations. So we're going there at the level of policy reform, in a sense, a stopgap measure to certain conversations. We can have the conversations around. A couple of weeks ago, I think there was an act that the politicians passed around seeds. Right? We can take that to court because we have the Constitution of Kenya, and 29 says, we can do that. So so it's understanding at what level this particular stakeholder can intervene. I think at the level of the state, I think the Constitution has given us space for a new social contract, and there's much to be done there within this new social contract that I think Kenyan civil society organizations, media, etc., have yet to do, that I think we can do as regards policy reform. As regards how do we put more money to small scale farmers, how do we subsidies for agricultural products, how do we market for the people, but understanding that limitation, there's also a different conversation that can happen within government. And I think the more radical conversation around sustaining our indigenous seeds at that really core level of really restoring our human dignity will either come from us reimagining a whole new society altogether. And I think both of these can happen concurrently.
I want to add two things. One,
Mm-hmm.
I think it's important to also understand the context in which smallholder farmers, the ones who are feeding Kenyans,
Mm-hmm.
the context in which they're farming, who they are as individuals, in what ways, what are their own attitudes towards the jobs that they're doing, because there's pieces of conversations you hear everywhere. There's that wider statistic about how Africa is going urban.
Mm-hmm.
So what does that mean for this farming, which is mostly done in rural areas? If the vast majority, remember, of Africans, there's a large chunk of us who are aged 15 and below, right? And that the assumption about this whole, everybody's going urban, nini, is that a large chunk of these people are going to move into urban areas, and that urban areas are not, they're not set up for smallholder farming, at least not the vast majority, right? So maybe in peri-urban areas, you might find some farming going on, but not, the way it happens in rural areas, which is where the vast majority of it goes on. So when we then go back to think about the individual smallholder farmer, in what context are they farming? What farming would they want to hand over, if that is a thing that they even want to hand over? There's a lot of conversations about land changing hands. So who owns land? Who gets land when smallholder farmers, transition to the next forms of existence? And then what is done with that land after that? And I think there's a lot of stuff happening there that hasn't quite been mapped while we are here focusing on, Africa is going urban, and, we have a demographic, bomb. What's the word? Demographic? Dividend, yes. And I hate the word dividend because that's a word for paying out for shares. It's not a word you use on people, this whole thing where we're just kind of salivating at the opportunity to extract from these young people because we've quote unquote invested in them. We kept them alive. It's quite, it has a terrible taste in the mouth. So that's one thing. That's actually the 2 points really, where we look at this population of people who have watched their parents and their grandparents and their relatives and their communities, the ones who are farmers, be heartbroken, be ignored, be underinvested in, have poor outputs, deal with the violence of middlemen, all of that, and still manage to feed people, and then look at their lives and decide that that's not the life that they want, and that that's a very valid point of view from the place that some of them are coming, and that there are not enough people who then romanticize the idea of farming and then go and set up a little, greenhouse, or you say, let me just, I have a little piece of land somebody left me, and then you leave your farming, you leave your city job or your white collar job, and then you have a little weekend jaunt, which is actually hobby farming. It's not career farming, because career farming is the one people cry when the rains don't come when they're supposed to come. It's not like, well, we planted the thing, it didn't work, let's try again. Like, career farming is like you buried your hopes and dreams and they were supposed to grow and bear fruit, and then now they don't. And I'm not saying that hobby farming is a bad thing, far from it. But I'm saying that hobby farming cannot solve systemic problems, right? In the same way that when Joe was talking about these systems are designed to work in certain ways to benefit some people, and that they have to extract from some people in order to benefit these others. It's how they're supposed to work, and then everything else was built around maintaining them and propping them up, which then means that truly the only way that that's going to change is massive reform. But it's also very easy to have these conversations at very high top line, but we have to come back consistently to who are we dealing with. And if we ask the farmers, are you happy about farming? Beyond the usual kind of election year statistic from the polls, 75% of Kenyans are worried that Kenya is going in the wrong direction. What does that mean for a farmer? What does that mean for a smallholder farmer who feeds their communities, who has relationships within the market, who, prays for the death of a middleman, whose child, is fed and goes to school based on the number of hohos that they harvest, or the number of fixie oranges? And I love that Kenyans call them fixie, with an F, right?
Fixie.
Fixie.
Oh.
They're pixies, but
Pixies, yeah.
because our tongues meet English where they meet it, because English is now ours. I love that people say now they're Englishes. There's no one English, because it doesn't belong to England anymore. When they diffused it out to everybody, it became ours. So now we can talk it how we want. But when we think about these young people who are supposed to take over in an agriculture heavy economy, what context are they entering farming from?
Yeah.
And then we have to talk about things like Moi and the 4K Club, and was that successful? And is that and then there's all these, let's make farming sexy again. And it's like, young people in Kenya will do anything if you tell them there's dignity here and there's money. You don't need to make that, like, the dignity and the money are sexy enough by themselves. Like, you don't need that, like farming has to have tech for young people to be interested in it. If you tell somebody that you can get a good salary from tilling the land, they will do it.
Absolutely. And you need to, alongside this investment, really, to think about the services that are offered to farmers. Because many of our farmers do not have a lot of money. So you should have, healthcare facilities nearby. You should have schools that are affordable nearby. You should have electricity and water nearby to allow it, to make it possible for them to produce. Because once, if they are struggling to send kids to school, how will they actually produce food for the families and the neighbors and so on? And Njoki, thanks a lot for bringing in the issue of urbanization, because if you look again at the ways in which Africa is urbanizing, it's actually urbanizing in highly agriculturally productive areas, red soil. You don't do that.
Yeah.
You don't do that. You don't grow your urban spaces where you should actually be growing crops. But again, that's what's happening. And
that's happening when we still don't have a plan for arid and semi-arid areas.
Absolutely.
No, we don't. And just to what you said, Prof, you have to be very careful about this urbanization conversation, because in Europe, for instance, the reason why they had a peasant proletariat is because guys left their farms in the 15th, 16th century, the Grand Revolution, to go to the urban cities to work in industries.
Yeah.
We are not industrializing as a continent, but yet we're still. So when we talk about the nature of urbanization, it has particular nuances and differences. Urban cities, as Dr. Ndi once wrote, are places where Africans, you live light, knowing that anything happened and you can move back home. So we really need to even see what are some of the factors that are influencing this idea called urbanization. And that's a space for policy reform, as a professor said. Is it health to the spaces? For a good example is in Kiambu with the coffee farms in Kiambu, because of the collapse of the global coffee markets and just a government spending. If you look at the government budget from 1980s to mid 1990s, every year it would go down to about 5-7%, no less, in terms of the budgeting. Currently, if you look at the budget of agriculture, as security goes up, agriculture budget goes down.
Wow.
Isn't it? So we're sectorizing the state, but agricultural budget, and we're talking about food security. Actually, food is actually the primary food security, aspect of our society. So I think there's a level of this kind of policy conversion saying, listen, look, our budget, food security budget, is our agriculture budget year by year is going down.
Yeah.
Hence, if you look at our military security budget, other areas is going up. Then how then do we fill those gaps such that we don't? Because in my view, what we're calling urbanization is really it's labor extraction. So it's an intentional starving of certain spaces. So people are forced either to make their land, a case in point Kiambu, red soil into
Apartments.
precisely because of the collapse of the coffee, tea prices, etc. But then also, even as we talk about the role of government, I think we also need to realize that the biggest impediment of the agriculture, education, security is the government.
Yeah.
We need to realize that government is the biggest regulator of things not moving. We saw the act recently about the seeds. So that means farmers may now have to buy from perhaps a government agency that is supplying those seeds. That shouldn't be.
Actually, not even government, but from private.
Precisely.
Yeah.
So we need to really think about how do we, more fundamentally around the conversation about how we can really talk to government, is like we need to have a conversation about how do we democratize our economy. How do we democratize our economy? I had a conversation I took with Kwame Wino, and in certain sectors, I mean, we know this. The sector you find political families or certain individuals have 70% of certain agricultural sectors, isn't it? So what does that mean for small scale farmers who are in that business where there's hostile takeovers, you're starved of logistics, transport? So because at the core of these things, that how do we now start having to democratize our economy? The Constitution give us a good baseline in Chapter 4, Chapter 11, Chapter 6. Give us a good baseline of how do we democratize our economy? How do we make sure some of the government bodies are just set there and they become cartels because of this? We have a feudal economy. So even part and parcel of making sure small scale farmers thrive is actually having conversations about we need to democratize our economy. We need to the Competition Commission needs to just say, listen, we need to one, we have a database of all companies. To one, for instance, two, we need to say in this sector, for instance, you can't have control more than 30% of the share market. So that gives wiggle room and agility, one, for supply chains to become more local, because if I know that I can control maybe my 0.3% market around Westlands Kilimani area, I can supply my groceries, my bean stuff. But then what happens if you go to Marigiti? Even at that local level, there's a cartel. So the regulation that the state puts, it in itself creates a catalyzation of society. So that even at the level where there isn't formal regulation, we call the informal sector, there's a cartel there.
It's actually wild because what we're then saying, especially to young people, and I really love reading. Well, I don't love it because the content is alarming and also not surprising at the same time. But when you read all these kind of attitudes of young people, do you know those studies?
Yeah.
Attitudes of young people towards X and Y and Z. And I think there was one where someone had studied, and I think it was the Khan University, I think. I could be wrong. But they had studied, I think, political, socio-economic attitudes of young people, I think in Kenya, Rwanda, Uganda. And young people said, I mean, if corruption is a way to, improve my life, then, I guess,
It's the
like,
deal.
it's not even a thing, right? And the thing that I wanted to point out there very specifically, and very tied to what Joe was saying, is that what we are communicating to young people is that you must be a plutocrat, right, in order to buy your way out of the generalized suffering of the Kenyan people. So you need to buy access to healthcare with dignity. You need to buy access to what people call, quote unquote, world class, which is another phrase I hate, world class education, right? You need to buy access to certain types of opportunities. You need to buy your way into certain rooms where your future is assured, because when you leave your future in the hands of the state, there's problems. And so then even the reason that people go into politics becomes that they want to control the hand of the state with regard to the outcomes for themselves, not necessarily to the outcomes of Kenyans at large, because maybe they think that, like, it's too far gone. The problems are too many. You can't solve them for everybody, but we can actually solve them for ourselves and our little cartel.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Njoki. From today's conversation, it's clear that the food on our plates is not just a combination of inert ingredients subjected to heat, but rather a reflection of various structural forces in contestation. As we conclude, do you have any closing remarks, Prof. Joe, Njoki?
Yeah, I think that I really like what Joe said with regard to reforms and the role of leadership. In whether that is national leadership or local leadership or even international leadership in ensuring that the world is food secure. I mean, and also recognizing that sometimes the state is held captive by multinationals, that we might think that they're actually very independent in decision making, but they are held captive, and therefore to understand the limits under which they're working, and especially where the state itself is dominated by people who are devoid or have integrity deficit, then you have a huge problem. So I think that for me, it's to look at these issues as interconnected. When one is talking about food, and food security, one would of course be also talking about the politics of food, the economics of food, the politics of land, and that's also recognizing that across Africa, land has been central to the democratization process, and that one cannot talk about the democratization of the continent at any one stage of that effort without paying attention to land. Whether it's at the point at which the Arabs are getting into the continent, or whether the Portuguese are getting onto the continent, or the Europeans, the land was always the critical heritage of our people, and they fought to retain it. And I don't see that stopping. Land and its various possibilities will always be the place where people retreat to claim their dignity. And I think that will happen even with the coming of multinationals and the investment in the large-scale land-based investments that the West is pushing for Africa to take up, to grow food for Europe and to grow food for America, and so on. I think that our people will push back at this because it's land that defines who they are. And I think that by paying more attention to what happens on the land, whether it is land being used for industrial purposes or land being used to secure, certain benefits and so on, it will always be it should be always be invoked to reclaim dignity and our humanity. I mean, because again, if you think about it, land is part of who we are. It's not disconnected from us. Therefore, our food coming from the ground, you know, and nourishing us, and then taking us back to the land is such a full circle. And finally, to say that at the African Union level, this year is supposed to be the year of nutrition and food security. And I'm actually looking closely to see how that idea of the year of nutrition and food security gets translated in terms of concrete action to secure, our foods, and to minimize the effects of multinationals, if in terms of controlling what we eat, and of course listening more to the small scale, holder, and the type of support and the type of knowledge. For me, I mean, even repackaging knowledge about food, and agriculture in local languages, because I mean, our farmers, notwithstanding the fact that they have a lot of knowledge, have every right to benefit from the knowledge that is coming out from the discoveries and so on, and that this knowledge needs to be repackaged and represented in different formats and in different languages. So again, thank you so much for today.
Yeah. One word that has really come up during this whole discussion is dignity. Over to you, Joe.
In 1992, we liberalized our politics, right? We introduced multi-party, and we had many more people in the public sphere having conversations. In 2010, we democratized the state. I mean, we're still in the throes of that social contract, that conversation. I think moving forward, even tied to even conversation around food, we need to really democratize our economy, because at the core of, I mean, as Njoki rightly said, plutocracy, oligarchy, it's really you have a bunch of you guys who want to hold everything for the rest of. So we really need to have that conversation around how do we democratize our economy. Of course, talking about in the food space is really talking about space for the small scale farmer. As Njoki again said, focusing back on those people, on the individuals and their stories, and centering those conversations, but also centering them in terms of policy. So we know small scale farmers access to a market, has access to farm inputs, extension services, and also around him, building an infrastructure around him. So if it's health sector, which Njoki is there as well, if it's education, really need to have a conversation on how we democratize our economy. The Competition Commission, which is a government body, really needs to say how do you democratize our agricultural sector such that when we have more players, because the reason why young individuals, as much as I told it's sexy, come and try it, and then they go back to, gigging and doing menial jobs, is because it's not democratized. You have sectors where you have political players or individuals who have monopolized the sectors, such that individual farmers can't sell their produce or can't gain access to certain markets. We have trade policies that make it that stifle small scale farmers to export their goods. So only certain players with enough capital can export their goods to certain parts of Europe where they'll, of course, accrue more profit. And even in those processes, since they're not democratized, this word that we like in Kenya a lot, they're cartels. But the reason why they're cartels is because it's not democratized. So if you have demand and less supply, these are rules of economics. You got a black market. The black market is infiltrated by all sorts of characters, from cartels to regulation. So we really need to move the conversation. Really, in my view, how does government regulation, in particular aspects, how does it undemocratize the food sector? How do certain players, if they're not checked, but private players in particular, how do multinationals access land in parts of the country with very few processes where you can find multinationals buying chunks of land in parts of the country and doing farming for export? And yet there are farmers who, with very little protection farmers have been literally conned. It's really conned out of the small pieces of land. So I think the conversation that we need to have, not just in the food space, but I think as a country, is that how do we democratize this economy?
Yeah, thank you so much, Joe. Okay.
Something Joe said has reminded me of a friend of mine who, also does weekend farming. And he was talking about somebody who he knows has gradually transitioned into full-time farming because of being able to get a significant amount of reliable income per month from a very small piece of land. Now, that is the ideal for the smallholder farmer. And the main question to ask is, why is the reality for this one person so vastly different from the realities of all other smallholder farmers? And how do we bridge this wide gap? Right? Because there's, again, globally, even in the region, even if you throw a stone, there's no shortage of people to feed. Like, that's not the issue. I feel like we'd been having very good problems if we got to the place where actually, even by statistics, we are generating so much food that everybody is full and they still surplus. Like, we have now problems of biblical proportions, in good ways, right? So that's one. With regard to tangible increases in the quality of life of the farmer as a person, not just as a worker. Because when we talk about the farmer, even the definition of this person as a farmer is that one who farms. And so in order for them to be looked at and considered, they have to be farming, right? Mm-hmm. So even if we are talking about, yes, what are the working conditions for the farmer? What are the occupational health situations? What is the enabling environment for them? That's all a business perspective. It's all an economic perspective. And we fall into the trap of, the people who are salivating over demographic dividend when we now salivate over these farmers and say, when we treat the farmers well enough, if we fertilize them, we water them, they will grow. Right. So we are also looking at them eager to extract. When again, if we go back to what Joe was saying at the beginning with regard to decoloniality as a revisibilization of the self, as one who is worthy of dignity, who is worthy to be seen, who does not need to earn any of those things, even by labor. So that is one whole thought. The other thought, the one that I want to conclude with, is with regard to nutraceuticals, and one of the widest gaps there is currently in Kenya with regard to healthcare. We're pretty savvy with regard to communicable diseases. We know a lot about significant numbers of them, including obviously HIV, where we are leading in the continent with regard to how we manage it. There's gaps for sure, but we have extremely progressive and quite radical policies, etc., with regard to HIV and AIDS management. Same with TB. Even with COVID, we've tried. There's been, again, massive gaps. There's still massive gaps going on. There's a lot of nonsense. But, communicable diseases, we are somewhere. Pneumonias, diarrheas, waterborne diseases, malaria, all of them. When you talk about non-communicable diseases, right, the gaps begin to show very significantly. There's a wide variety of people who, will tell you, I have sugar, niko na sukari, but then we don't understand what that means. How does that change your quality of life? What do you, etc., etc. Same thing with niko na pressure. I have pressure, which is high blood pressure. And one of the biggest boogeymen in non-communicable disease information and public health education is cancer, right? And so now when we think about one of the biggest stories, like it's very easy for media, and here I will point at Joe, now that I was pointed at for coming late. But with regard to media, like media will go viral immediately the minute they'll say something like, if you sit next to a if you sit next to a plastic chair in the sun, you are at risk of insert cancer. If you stand, at the full moon and howl facing southwest, you are at risk of cancer X. If your child, walks to the kiosk with another child and you don't know what that child ate in the morning, and maybe they share it, and then, so you're being fed something that you don't know, you are at risk of, the sukuma wiki that Nairobians are buying, you are at risk of. So there's a lot of And so there's a lot of virality with regard to the spreading of these incomplete bits of information, but with regard to types of cancer. And then another thing that has really gone viral is the idea that if you eat healthy enough, you will be able to stave off these things, which is also an incomplete idea. And then again, we turn to the farmer, as the redeemer. And then now we all want to be able to start growing our own, and we are back to the ndoma, and we're back to the massive numbers of green vegetables that we have, and animals that are treated well and all of that. And then so now people want to eat healthy in order to escape illness. And this is illness that we don't have enough knowledge about, because there's no amount of eating organically that will save you, for instance, for something that's coming from you, coming for you because it's present in your genes and in your family. And there's no amount of eating healthily that will save you from like maybe a stage 4 thing that we only discovered late. But then you're in a village where they don't do those types of treatments because the only facility they have access to is level 3. So there's a lot of issues there where again food becomes central, and where food is both kind of deified and vilified, when neither of those things is actually the center. The center again is the dignity and the right of the people to health, which got ignored at the level of the state, whether it is a national, state, or even at the level of the county, because that's one of the biggest issues that we're having, that the county governments are saying we're not getting enough budget to run health for everybody. And the national government is saying, see, we devolved, and that there's issues there with regard specifically to that thing. So I wanted to point out that the idea of the nutraceutical food as healing, it does have a very shadowy side where people want to turn again to food and to the farmer to save them because of a gap with regard to where the state should be intervening, and that the gaps are knowledge gaps, they're resource gaps, when they're not really food gaps, but food is the one that's being brought into the thing so easily.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, we've now come to the end of the show. Thank you so much, Njoki, Professor, and Joe, for the interesting insights.
Asante, it was lovely to listen to you both.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for being an awesome audience. Comment, like, share, subscribe. Asante sana for listening.